What up, Hyperchange? Welcome to another episode. Today we are doing a book review of Bad Blood by John Carreyrou, Secrets and Lies in a Silicon Valley Startup. Huge shout out to Tim from Cheddar for giving me the recommendation for this book. I loved it. I blasted through it in just a couple days. It had me hooked from start to finish. Bad Blood is the behind-the-scenes story of Theranos, the incredibly, at one point, seemingly disruptive unicorn company founded by Elizabeth Holmes, who at one point was touted as the next Steve Jobs or Bill Gates. Well, the reality of their technology and their company is so different than what was portrayed in the media through the company's meteoric rise. And, this book written by John Carreyrou, who was the Wall Street Journal reporter who actually started breaking some of the fraudulent sides of this story. This book totally opened my eyes to what Theranos was actually doing. A couple years back, I remember hearing about Theranos. They were an incredibly disruptive technology company with this vision of taking just a single prick of your blood and being able to run hundreds of different tests on that, making it so much more convenient than the traditional system of having a huge needle draw massive amounts of blood. This was changing the paradigm of medical technology in theory, or at least that's what the vision was. Elizabeth Holmes wanted to put these little devices in every single person's home and allow you to prick your own blood, put it in this machine. The results will get beamed back to your doctor. This is a new paradigm of healthcare. So many people bought into this vision, including myself. I thought the company had incredible potential. I remember them hitting their valuation of $9 billion, showing my dad, who is actually a scientist and a doctor, and him being incredibly skeptical that the company had no data. Of course, I wrote him off because he's skeptical about everything. But now, the Theranos story has sort of crumbled in the media and you're hearing about all their problems. But this book really tells the entire story, and it is so much worse than you actually think. And I don't actually think that Elizabeth Holmes started out trying to commit a fraud or deceive investors or the public, but eventually she did, and I would consider it a case of incrementalism. I just believe the lies started out small. Originally, what their technology said they can do and the reality of the situation was in line, but eventually as the technology couldn't keep up with the milestones that she was promising investors, she eventually started to lie, and they started to, fudge the numbers and not exactly be transparent and not be honest and not use integrity. And eventually you got a company that was totally on every single level doing the wrong thing. They were giving financial projections that they knew were way wrong to investors. They were having regulators come in and check their facility, but not check the part that they were actually running the tests on. They would use these incredible intimidation tactics to get employees to keep their mouths shut after they left the company with concerns about how they were running their data and, the integrity of the operation. So now let's go through some of the parts of the book that I highlighted that I thought were particularly notable. Just this part in the beginning of the book gives some interesting context to when Theranos was founded. When it really started heating up was in 2009 and 2010, right after the Great Recession, and there was this new sort of aura around unicorn startups. Twitter had just reached a valuation of $1 billion. This thing called Uber Cab had just launched. The iPhone was showing that billion-dollar businesses could be built on top of apps and smartphones. And this excitement was fueling a venture capitalist boom in Silicon Valley that gave way to Theranos' initial funding and sort of aura as this incredibly disruptive tech company. And my favorite part that sums this up, every VC wanted a seat on the next rocket ship to riches. This is the FOMO mentality of Silicon Valley that led to Theranos. This is probably the biggest psychological flaw within Silicon Valley and the companies that partnered with Theranos, which is why they were able to get so far, which was fear of missing out. Sure, we don't know if Theranos is legit. We don't know if this is the real thing. But if it is, it's so good to be true that we can't not afford to miss this and let our competition get in on it. And that is the mentality that drove a lot of very smart people past the doubts and the skepticism of Theranos' technology, and just they wanted to believe and they wanted to get on that next seat to the rocket to riches. This is an interesting insight about when Theranos was working with Safeway to launch their finger prick test in Safeway stores, sort of turn them into these new era futuristic sort of pharmacies. This was a huge project that Safeway had been hyping up, and they give the perspective from one of the employees when Elizabeth Holmes announced the launch of this big partnership, and the product that they wanted to put into these Safeway stores and actually have patients testing their blood on was totally a prototype. The way they describe it here, I think, is awesome. It's called the mini lab. The mini lab Greg was helping to build was a prototype. Nothing more. It needed to be tested thoroughly and fine-tuned, which would require time, a lot of time. Most companies went through 3 cycles of prototyping before they went to market with a product. But Sunny was already placing orders for components to build 100 mini labs based on first, untested prototype. It was as if Boeing built on one plane and without doing a single test flight told airline passengers, hop aboard. This is just summing up almost the entire mentality of Theranos. They would hype up this incredibly disruptive technology. They could test all these little tests in their tiny little device. But the reality of the situation was those tests were not accurate. None of the data was reliable. It was totally not ready for prime time, especially in a medical setting, but they pushed ahead anyway. And that is just so ridiculous and morally so wrong, in my opinion, that is where the Theranos story really starts to go off the rails. And the person that I mentioned here, Sunny, who is already pushing ahead of this, Sunny Balwani, he's a very interesting character that comes into the story around 2009. He got super rich in the '01 internet bubble, and then eventually, was 25 or 30 years older than Elizabeth Holmes, but apparently was her boyfriend secretively, and eventually came in as executive vice president of the company. Apparently he's described as sort of this loud, Lamborghini driving, incredibly intimidating asshole, basically, who would just tell people exactly what to do. He would fire people on the spot. He had no experience in science or medical devices or anything like that. It just seems like he was totally irrational and angry at all times. I don't know if that's the reporting in this book. And so when you think about the Theranos story, although Elizabeth Holmes is the only person you see or hear about in the media, Sunny Balwani was sort of her partner and her boyfriend at the time and was helping her run the company as this dynamic duo and sort of, dictatorship. This part is honestly just really sad. Ian Gibbons, who was one of the first people to work at Theranos, an incredibly well-renowned scientist. His name is on many of Theranos' first and most important patents. He developed, the early stages of their technology. It came to the point of when lawyers eventually started getting their hands on this, they wanted to talk to Ian Gibbons because he was on all these patents, and they were curious how Elizabeth Holmes was also listed as the main person on those same patents as a 19-year-old Stanford dropout. How much could she have really contributed to the science of what Theranos was doing? And in reality, they suspected that this scientist, Ian Gibbons, had really come up with the bulk of the discoveries. By the time they tried to get him to testify in court, Theranos was hounding him. He was going into a huge depression. They had siloed him into this tiny corner of the company from originally being the main scientific guy, and he eventually commits suicide right before he's supposed to go testify in court about all of this. And yeah, I don't know. I'm sort of speechless. This part was sort of a heartbreaking part of the book. And why it stands out to me is because they describe it is because Tony Nugent, who was another person working at Theranos at the time, it says he became very upset that nothing was done to honor his late colleague's memory. And so the point kind of being here is the second he died and passed away of this suicide, Elizabeth Holmes made no mention of it. She didn't give him any credibility at the company. This is someone who had dedicated more than a decade of their life to Theranos, and she sort of just brushed it off. So I don't know, this part to me just really shows you just how evil and how Theranos had just really had no morals whatsoever. This is incredibly interesting. So Elizabeth Holmes hired the creative agency that was famous for making some of Apple's best work when Steve Jobs was at the company. She had this obsession with becoming a billionaire, being the next Steve Jobs. She even wore the turtlenecks like him. She scheduled meetings on Wednesday with the same creative agency because that's when Steve Jobs and Apple had meetings with this creative agency. And another angle behind this Theranos story is the reason why it got so far is David Bowie's, or I don't know if I'm saying that right, he was regarded as one of the world's best lawyers at the time. He probably still is today, was working and defending the company. And so that's why they had this incredible legal defense. And you might be saying, well, how did they afford that or pay for that? Bowie's was actually given a bunch of equity in Theranos. So he was trying to, help the company succeed. And first of all, that means Theranos isn't paying him millions of dollars to represent them. Second of all, that means that he's incentivized by more than capital. His reputation's on the line. He owns stock in the company. That's why he's working his ass off to fight their legal case. This is a recurring theme through Theranos, is you see them having these absurd moments where the second you say anything to a reporter, their lawyers come at you with this massive statement that is incredibly threatening and intimidating. They really went through all sorts of ways to use lawyers to try and, manipulate the situation any way they could. It got ugly. It got really ugly. George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, Robert Mattis, these incredibly high up people at the military believed in her and were on her board of directors. The one thing they had in common, nobody knew any science. Nobody who was an expert in blood testing was on their board of directors. No venture capital funds that an expert in healthcare ever invested in the company. In retrospect, these are huge red flags that now make a ton of sense. And at the end of the day, Elizabeth Holmes' vision of using a prick of blood and transforming healthcare and saving all these people people from diseases was incredibly inspiring, and I hope like allows people to think outside the box about medicine. And I hope people are actually working on solutions like Theranos' vision, because that would be a better future. And that is what I think gets lost in this story, is that the journalist, takes a very negative view from start to finish on the whole company, and also doesn't give them the upside of saying like, hey, look, at the end of the day, their vision would have been amazing for medicine. The problem was their execution was totally wrong. In fact, it was so wrong, and they went through so many hoops to make it look like they were crushing it, and they lied so much that they genuinely put patient lives at risk in the real world. And that is where, to me, the Theranos story is so much worse than anything we've heard in tech or anything recently, because they're genuinely putting people's health at risk just to make the company seem like it was crushing it. And that is where the line gets drawn. That is where I think they should be potentially serving, like, I don't know. So anyway, I hope my ramblings give you guys a sense of this book. I was hooked on it from start to finish. I will say about 2/3 of the book through, I thought the drama was going to keep ramping up, and there was going to be some huge like crescendo moment where Elizabeth Holmes gets totally screwed and it all comes crashing down, because you realize it's just a house of cards, but it doesn't actually end like that. And you realize there's still a couple chapters to be written in this saga. We still don't know if they'll serve jail time or not, or what the real endgame for Theranos is. So that's an interesting twist to the story. Overall, I'm giving this 4.5 out of 5 stars. I would have given it 5, but it's just like the end of the book just didn't have enough oomph for me. Maybe that's just because the story in reality didn't have enough oomph, but that just left me wanting a little more. But I think you gotta read this. I had a blast reading it. Also, if you guys have any other book recommendations for me, please let me know in the comments below. If you like Hyperchange, definitely check out our Patreon page and consider supporting there. Anyway, I'll see you guys next time. Peace.